Welcome to this third presentation in our series on the Ten Commandments as they're presented in the Anglican Catechism. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at Commandments 6 through 8, which is questions 307 to 338 in the Catechism. But first, let's begin with prayer. O God, you have prepared for those who love you such good things as surpass our understanding. Pour into our hearts such love toward you, that we, loving you in all things and above all things, may obtain your promises, which exceed all that we can desire, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, the sixth commandment is the commandment that you shall not murder in Exodus 20:13. And the logic of this commandment for the Old Testament, as well as for the New, is essentially this. First, life is fundamentally understood as a gift from God. God is the giver of all life, and God is sovereign over that gift. Therefore, murder is, in effect, an attack, a denial of God's sovereignty over life. The person who murders someone else says, I don't really care that life is a gift, and I don't really care that God is sovereign over it. I'm going to exercise my sovereignty over it. In some ways, then, murder is sort of the archetypal example of sin, the human rebellion against God. Question 309 in the Catechism makes a really important point when it says that because all human life is sacred, from conception to natural death, I may not take the life of others. So all taking of life here in this sense is considered unjust. Murder is a denial of God's sovereignty over life, but it's also a denial of our responsibility for other people. And in that sense, murder is the archetypal violation of Jesus' summary of the law in Matthew 22. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Murder violates both those simultaneously in a fairly radical way. So murder is an archetypal example of the failure to love God and the failure to love neighbor. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes it clear that the root of murder is malice in the heart. Malice in the heart, Jesus says, is the root of all murder. This is Matthew 5:21 to 26. And Jesus then says, we're not to harm a neighbor either in thought, malice in the heart, or in action, a physical action of harming a neighbor, because both the thought and the action proceed from a heart that's infected by malice, and malice is one of the symptoms of sin. So we should focus our attention, Jesus says, on enabling our neighbor to flourish. You might want to take a look at question 315 in the Catechism on that point. That is, the way to kind of fulfill, or the way to kind of work against our tendency to have malice toward other people is to love our neighbor and to actively do good to and for them. As sinners, as Jesus points out, the anger that we typically have is self-righteous anger rather than righteous anger. Anger can be just if it's motivated by the right things. Anger can be just if it's not motivated by ungodly fear or pride or a desire for revenge. But rather, anger can be just if it's truly motivated by the love of God and the love of neighbor. If you see someone If you see like an older woman being mugged on a street corner or something like that, she's been knocked to the ground, someone's taken her purse, it's actually just to be angry in that situation because you're witnessing an injustice. So there's righteous anger and there's unrighteous anger, just anger and unjust anger. As I mentioned, murder is the disregard for God's sovereignty over life. And this can be expressed in a number of forms according to the Catechism. Question 312 offers some things that fall under the category of murder. And here are some of those things in that list. Suicide, the taking of one's own life, abortion, genocide, infanticide, euthanasia, as well as hatred, abuse, derision, physical or emotional abuse. So from the Catechism's perspective, the prohibition against murder is fairly wide. It's not just about not killing people. It's also about deriding them, hating them, threatening physical or emotional abuse against them. Anything that falls short of the active love of God or the active love of neighbor comes under this prohibition, according to the Catechism. One of the difficult things that we encounter here is that in our culture, in modern culture, more and more typically, people understand themselves as sovereign over their own lives. And therefore, they're apt to see their lives solely as under their own control. We have to be reminded here that this is not the Christian view of things. We are not sovereign over our own lives, and we're certainly not sovereign over the lives of others. God is sovereign over all of life, and all of life is a gift that's to be stewarded and valued and also cared for. Question 316, I think, also adds sort of a helpful note to all this. It says that what Christians should be doing by way of living out this commandment is we should be about the work of defending the vulnerable and the oppressed, rescuing those who are seeking to harm themselves, and working for the well-being of all. So question 316 expands our responsibility out to include working for the well-being of all people. Now, typically in the Western tradition of the church, there's a distinction made between murder and killing, and so I want to take a brief look at that distinction. Within Western Christianity, there's been the recognition that not all killing is murder. Murder proceeds from unrighteous anger, the desire for revenge, the desire to exert your sovereignty over someone else. There are, however, situations in which justice and mercy might require the use of lethal force to protect the innocent or the vulnerable. If you have a large population of vulnerable people that maybe some terrorist organization is going to take lethal action against them, it would be an act of justice and mercy to use lethal force to prevent that from happening. So there are scenarios and situations in which the use of lethal force might be required to protect the innocent, and that would not fall under the prohibition against murder. It's really important here, however, that we be mindful of the fact that in Matthew 5:38-42, Jesus says that revenge is off limits to Christians. It's never just for Christians to engage in the taking of revenge, because that is seen as lacking confidence in the justice of God. Now, the protection of the innocent and the weak and the defenseless obviously is one of the primary roles of civil government, and that's one of its primary responsibilities, as well as the maintaining of a just order. The idea here is that the maintaining of a just order benefits everyone, because a just order is one that provides equitable protections for everyone, as well as ways of addressing abuses within that society. So as we think about this commandment, we want to remember that according to the Catechism, we're not just talking about Christians refraining from killing people. We're talking about our overall responsibility to work for the well-being and the flourishing of those around us, and for us to be aware of our obligation to be about that thing. Here we might want to conclude this meditation on the sixth commandment by saying that there's a really important calling for Christians here to be active in political life. That is, political life is one of the ways in which it's possible to further the betterment of society, to strengthen the institutions of justice, for defending the vulnerable and the defenseless. And so there's a really important calling here for Christians to enter into and to be involved in the lives of society through political action and also even holding office. Let's take a look at the seventh commandment. The seventh commandment in Exodus 20:14 is very brief and to the point. You shall not commit adultery. So let's think about that. Strictly speaking, adultery is a married person having sexual relations with someone to whom they are not married. That is, sexual relations outside of marriage. That point's made clear in question 318 of the Catechism. But there's a really important presupposition that's operative here, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that we need to take a look at. And that's this. The assumption here is that the act of sexual relations between two people is not just simply a physical act, but rather it's a spiritual act as well. That is, the sexual relationship between two people is seen as a giving of oneself to another. It's not just a physical act, but it's also an emotional and a spiritual act as well. And this is the reason why Scripture and the Christian tradition has tended to restrict sexual relationships to the covenant of marriage. Within the covenant of marriage, husband and wife commit to give themselves to each other physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And those three things can't be pulled apart and separated out into nice compartments. And so the idea here is that sexual relationships belong solely in the covenant of marriage, because it's solely in this context where sexual relationships can take place according to God's intention and design. Another way to say that is to say this, that the Bible presumes, that sexual relationships between husband and wife are a sign of the covenant relationship that they have with one another, very much like a wedding ring is a symbol of that covenant relationship. So notice the idea here. Sexual relations between husband and wife are one of the signs of that covenant relationship, which is why sexual relations are then restricted to the context of that covenant relationship. Now, marriage serves some really important purposes, and question 323 in the Catechism sets out three major purposes that God has for marriage. The first purpose that's listed is the procreation and nurture of children. Obviously, the sexual relationship between husband and wife is a procreative relationship. It's capable of producing new life. And it's in that context in which children can be most properly nurtured, with the examples and the support of both a father and a mother. So the procreation and nurture of children is one of the chief purposes of marriage. The second purpose of marriage that's listed in question 323 is the establishment of a bond of affection between husband and wife, between man and woman. Very often in our culture, we're aware of sometimes the acrimony and the antipathy between men and women. The institution of marriage is designed to create a bond of affection between husband and wife. It's a way of actually dealing with that antipathy and those somewhat negative relationships that can exist. So within the context of marriage, husband and wife come to depend upon one another. There is a particular friendship, there's a particular love, there's a particular mutual dependence that evolves within the context of marriage, and that's one of God's purposes as well. A final purpose that question 323 lists, and this is really not unique to it, but we find this in the Western tradition beginning with St. Augustine, is that marriage also represents or also offers a sort of remedy for sexual impurity. That is, in the context of marriage allows for the practice of sexual relationships and therefore the practice of sexual purity, in the sense that the sexual relationships are now kept to the context of a loving relationship in which there is a mutual self-giving between husband and wife. We also want to remember here that marriage is, in effect, the fundamental institution of society. Marriage, in effect, is the foundation upon which all civilization is built. Marriage is not only that place where new life is brought into the world, but also where that new life is nurtured and formed. And so no society can be more healthy than the marriages or families within it, which is why Western law has always regarded the relationship between husband and wife and the relationship of families to be so important. It's because they're foundational to the social order. In Ephesians 5:21-35, Paul offers us a wonderful vision of marriage. He says that marriage reflects the love of Christ for the church, and not just the love, but the self-sacrificial love. So Paul tells wives they should submit to their husbands, but then he turns around and says that husbands should love their wives just as Christ loved the church, that is, self-sacrificially. So we might want to say these three things about married love in terms of characterizing it. First, married love is covenanted love. It's love that's bound by promises. So if you look at the wedding vows in the Book of Common Prayer, the really interesting thing about them is they're unconditional. The wedding promises are made unconditionally. They're unconditional promises of love. So it's covenanted love. It's also self-sacrificial love. In the context of marriage, husband and wife sacrifice one another for each other. As one marriage counselor likes to say, marriage is never 50-50. Sometimes it's 90-10, sometimes it's 95-5, sometimes it's 99-1. That's the way that marriage tends to be. And it schools us in self-sacrificial love. A third marital love is that it's faithful love. It's the love of husband and wife, in terms of its faithfulness, should mirror Christ's faithfulness to the church. In the Book of Common Prayer, in the wedding liturgy, we're told that a marriage is a relationship in which husband and wife are exclusively devoted to one another in heart, mind, and body. It's an exclusive relationship of heart, of mind, and of body. Now, the question of divorce eventually comes up. And within Anglicanism, there are provisions for situations under which divorce occurs. Those primarily tend to be abuse or simply abandonment. When your husband or wife begins to abuse you, or when they simply leave you, that's one of the contexts in which divorce can be contemplated. But we always want to recognize that whenever a divorce takes place, we have to recognize that God's intention for marriage has been violated, in the sense that God's intention for every marriage is that it be a lifelong relationship. Sometimes, unfortunately, due to human sin, that relationship is corrupted and destroyed, and that's when divorce occurs. But whenever it does occur, it goes against God's intentions. And so a divorce is always an occasion for a kind of deep sadness for a brokenness that has taken place. in that context. Jesus has some important things to say about the roots of adultery in Matthew 5:27-30 in the Sermon on the Mount. He largely grounds the occasions of adultery in lust. So once again, Jesus says, adultery isn't just an action, it has its origin in the heart. And so we have to be careful of what's going on in our hearts. And basically what he says is this. Jesus says that one of the problems with us as sinners is that we tend to engage in what he calls lust. And what he means by that, I think, is this. When we look at another person solely as an object for our own personal gratification, we are looking at that person as an object of lust. We're denying their humanity. We're denying their individuality. And we are now looking at them solely as a potential object of our gratification. The way to work against that tendency has traditionally been called chastity. That is, chastity is our refusal, our disciplined refusal, to look at other people simply as objects for our own gratification, and to try to behave and also think toward them in a way that both honors them as human beings and also is an act of love toward them that enables them to flourish as well. The wonderful thing about chastity is that it gives us a wonderful interior freedom. That is, freedom from lust enables us to engage in marriage properly. It frees us to engage in friendships properly. Chastity enables relationships between the two sexes to take place properly. So chastity offers a kind of interior freedom in which true friendship can actually occur. Closing on this commandment, we probably want to say that all Christians are called to practice chastity, whether they're married or not married. Those who are married are called to practice marital chastity in the sense of being exclusively devoted to their spouse. And those Christians who are single are called to the chastity of celibacy for as long as they remain single. One final thought as we close this presentation on the seventh commandment. Question 329 offers some, I think, important observations about what it might mean to keep this commandment. It notes that the prohibition against adultery also is a prohibition against things like sexual harassment or sexual abuse or pornography. It lists a number of other things, but I think that it's also calling our attention to the fact that things like sexual harassment or sexual abuse or pornography, these things also violate the dignity of other people and therefore fall under this important prohibition. Now, finally, let's take a look at the eighth commandment. You shall not steal. Exodus 20, verse 15. Now, it's really important to say at this point that this commandment has an important Old Testament context. It's not that the Old Testament is sort of really fixated on property, because it's really not. In the Old Testament, the prohibition against stealing actually presupposes an outlook on the individual. That is, to steal something from someone is actually to harm them. If you steal your neighbor's cow, or if you damage something that belongs to your neighbor, you're actually harming your neighbor as a person. You certainly may be actually harming their livelihood or their family. So the idea here is that the honoring of the property of other people is a form of honoring them. So not stealing is a form of loving your neighbor. Theft of any kind is the refusal to love one's neighbor. And so we need to think, I think, very carefully about this. As we think about ourselves, we need to think about ourselves not primarily as possessors of property, but rather as stewards of what comes from God. This is another factor in the Old Testament prohibition of theft. That is, the idea here is that whatever we have comes to us as a gift from God. And therefore, we're not to think of ourselves primarily as owners of things. Rather, we're to think of ourselves primarily as people who have been given gifts by God, which we then steward for the benefit of ourselves, but also for the benefit of others. There's more about that in question 337 in the Catechism. The Catechism also notes correctly that in the Old Testament, there's a provision for the restitution of stolen property, the forbidding of charging interest on loans, and also the forbidding of oppressing the poor. These were all seen as ways of stealing. So if you loan money to a poor person and then charge them interest on top of that, for the Old Testament, that was wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. Or if you cheated someone out of their wages, once again, that was stealing from them. To oppress the poor, once again, that's an act of theft. So the Old Testament has a fairly large notion of what constitutes stealing. Question 321 in the Catechism attempts to update the notion of theft in a kind of modern technological society. So it says that we can steal from people in a variety of ways. We steal from other people when we harm their reputation, when we steal their wages or their identity, when we steal intellectual property, or when we cast doubt upon their work, or when we try to destroy their credit or reputation. All these are ways of stealing from someone, and once again, they are violations of the teaching that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, it's important to remember that for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, all things fundamentally belong to God. And you and I are simply stewards of those things. And because God's given us creation, God's given creation for the common good. That is, the whole point of creation is that it serves and meets the needs of everyone, not just those who have enough money or have enough influence or something like that. But the point of creation is to meet the needs of everyone. And therefore, we should always be thinking in terms of the common good. That should be what is most uppermost in our minds. Question 337 in the Catechism, I think, offers an important thought. It says, as we think about what we have, we should think about using it to glorify God and to further the good of creation. I think those are two wonderful ways of thinking about how we exercise our stewardship over what we have. To use what we have to glorify God, and also for the betterment of or for the good of creation, or for the common good. One of the things that comes up here in any discussion of theft is what our consumer culture tends to school us in. Our consumer culture tends to school us to constantly want more and more and more. And the cumulative effect of that is we become blind to what God's given us. We come to take what we have for granted, and we simply want more and more and more. And so the reason why the Bible is so down on greed or possessiveness is this. Greed and possessiveness blind us to the generosity of God. Greed blinds us to what we have and only helps us to focus on what we don't have, and we kind of constantly want more and more and more. So greed blinds us to the generosity of God. One final thought about this, about the eighth commandment, is this. As we think about theft, we also have to think about its opposite. That is, once again, the focus is not just on not stealing or not harming people or something like that, but rather to think about this commandment positively. How can we use what we have to both support our own lives and the lives of our families, but also to benefit and to bless others? That's the fundamental question posed to us by the 8th commandment.